This morning, our chalice lighters are Portia, Owen, and Piper Sykes, and as they make their way forward, we invite you to rise in body or spirit to speak aloud the words of the affirmation, which can be found on the back of the bulletin. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer, to dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve human need. For these high purposes do we unite in worship.
May the light we now kindle inspire us to use our powers to heal and not to harm, to help and not to hinder, to bless and not to curse, to serve you, Spirit of freedom.
Please remain standing.
My friends, during interim ministry, as this congregation is pursuing now, the topic of change comes up a lot. Interim ministry is a time for considering new ideas, new information, new habits, new perspectives on what it means to be a community of liberal faith. During such intentional change, there may be periods or activities when we feel less centered, less grounded, as we move away from what is familiar. You may recall in a worship service back in November, we considered some qualities of change, some features of what change might look like. Let's review a few of those ideas, which I suggested earlier, and then consider some new ideas for trusting change. The more we trust the changes we are experiencing, the more we can find those places of centering, of groundedness, of stability, as we move forward with new habits, new relationships, new ways of thinking and being. So back in November, I noted that change is all around us. Our cells are constantly changing, constantly being replaced. Change indeed is a sign of both being alive and moving forward. Any liberal religious community is almost always in some process of change. Things are never the same from day to day, it seems sometimes. UUs didn't title our current hymnals Singing the Living Tradition, the gray hymnal, and Singing the Journey, the teal hymnal, for nothing. Both titles convey a sense of aliveness. Congregational life seems to always be moving forward. Granted, in this particular time of interim ministry, the change is just more intentional to consider new ideas, new ways, new relationships. Interim ministry invariably includes conversations in which a congregation addresses deep questions of identity, mission, and purpose, such as you explored during a startup workshop back in November. In the worship service on change back in November, I also invited a few thought exercises of you. You may recall those exercises. I invited you to a self-assessment of your relationship with change. I asked, when you hear the word change, or when you realize you're caught up in some change, what reactions or emotions arise in you? What is your personal relationship with change? I'll ask these questions again now, today. As a general principle, how do you relate to change? What about specific changes you are currently experiencing? Do you welcome change? Do you relish new habits? Perhaps you are the opposite. You are hesitant about change. You resist it. You would prefer that things stay the same. Thank you very much. We all do our best, I expect, to do what we can to make the changes that do come along as positive as possible or as life-giving. But it bears repeating that if we have negative reactions to change, it might not be change that we resist or fear. Instead, it might be loss, not change, but loss that we fear. Loss of familiar ways of existing in the world, loss of familiar relationships. If you're hesitant about change, or if you tend to avoid making changes in your personal life or here in this congregation, I invite you to recall the verse in our opening hymn when we sang, "Don't be afraid of some change." Remember that verse from the opening hymn? Enter, rejoice, and come in. We can still rejoice and come in even when we experience change. Back in November, I also suggested two other images of change. One is called the roller coaster of change, which we also reflected on during the History Timeline workshop a few weeks ago. The roller coaster of change looks somewhat like my humble rendering here on this sheet on the pulpit this morning. The message about this roller coaster and what it represents is that when we hear news about some change, the moment we hear the news, to echo the reading by Reverend Herring, we react. We hear about news of change. It may put us off balance, it may put us off center. We often may go up in energy initially, and then wondering what the change will be like, we go down in energy, as we realize that a process of change actually lies ahead. And then we may come back up in energy with energy and enthusiasm as we live into the change. So this image of a roller coaster, I think, is a descriptive one for how we experience change in most any context. Another message on this roller coaster is that most likely in any given community, different people are probably at different points on the roller coaster in terms of being on board with the change. That is, different people reach different feelings of new centeredness at different points in the change process. When we make the turn from the decreasing energy back up to the other side, to the positive feelings of change. And it usually happens that leaders are ahead of the general population in acclimating to any given change, usually because they have had longer to work with the change. So I would invite you to ask yourself and answer for yourself, where are you on this roller coaster of change as it concerns interim ministry in this congregation? Another lens on change, which I described earlier, is to consider two modes of change. Some changes are technical, that is, a change of a single habit or a function. For example, we cut out a particular food with hopes of shedding a few pounds. I'll leave it for you to decide which food it is that you try to cut out to preserve that image of yourself. A technical change, a single food, versus an adaptive change, that is a change of culture or mindset, or more encompassing habits, which usually have longer-term results. For example, a major reorientation of your eating habits, technical versus adaptive. Adaptive change is usually more challenging, and yet probably more rewarding in the long run. In congregational life, an adaptive change, which was agreed on during that November startup workshop, was a new mindset about volunteering in this congregation. Not just a technical change of recruiting a single person for a particular committee or a task force, but adapting to a more intentional culture of volunteering from each and every member of the community. This example of adaptive change promotes shared ministry, which should be a goal for all UU congregations, especially during interim periods. Shared ministry is also so important. We're still in the aftermath of stresses from the COVID pandemic. To be together in shared ministry continues to matter. So I'll invite you again to another personal reflection. Rhetorical question for now. How do you make adaptive changes in your personal life, in this congregation? Have you experienced any adaptive changes lately? How have you let go of former habits or attitudes or relationship, really moved into new habits? It seems pretty clear that when we trust change, we can be more centered, more focused on making that change as productive as possible. Finding our center, that's the theme for this month in worship and in Soul Matters. Finding our center. And finding our center and keeping our center through change. Think about one of the quintessential images of trusting change, often cited in change literature, the trapeze artist. Flying through the air from the hands of one trapeze colleague to another. The acrobat who is doing the flying from the hands of one to the other must stay centered on the trick, must stay centered on what they are doing. Not to speak of trusting that after letting go of the hands of the first partner and flying through the air to reach the next partner will be there at just the right moment and just the right time. Indeed, without trusting that change, that acrobatic trick won't work, and the acrobat may end up in the safety net. It's one thing to know theories about change, such as this one I just described about technical versus adaptive. It's quite another to live comfortably in change, and especially to believe in the changes we're immersed in. As part of our adult education program, a few congregants recently joined me in studying this new book I just highlighted earlier. This is published by the UUA. It's called Trusting Change. It's written by one of my minister colleagues, Reverend Karen Herring, who I met a few months ago when I was attending the professional training that we interim ministers are urged to attend several times a year. The reading I offered earlier is from her new book, which offers many practical ideas, not just for understanding change, but for trusting change. The more we can trust any change, even if we don't know its eventual outcome, the more centered and aligned we can feel. So for a few moments, I want to offer two concepts, two metaphors really, about change, which we read about in this book. I'm finding both metaphors really useful in trusting change in my personal life and in how I discern to best support this congregation through interim change. See if these two metaphors speak to you. Both are about letting go of the old, passing into the new. The first image, the first metaphor about change that we read about is that of a chrysalis. You know, that state of transformation when a caterpillar goes to become a butterfly, a chrysalis. As a caterpillar prepares for the journey toward butterflyhood and attaches to a leaf as a landing spot for transformation, it creates a protective shell, which it actually sheds several times over as it builds new shells to protect that inner busy work of transformation, which is going on within the chrysalis. Inside the chrysalis, by releasing enzymes, that caterpillar essentially is breaking down its previously recognized self as a caterpillar. The cells which will eventually become a butterfly have been there all along, but they're changing from caterpillar to butterfly. Within the small shell housing the former caterpillar, a relentless churning occurs, as what used to be caterpillar becomes eye or wing or leg of butterfly. Reverend Karen gives this churning state an appropriately descriptive name. She describes this churning of change as a mass of goo. Goo. She relates the inside of the chrysalis to a thick soup cooking up something new. See if this metaphor, goo, works for you. Our reading group found the image of GRU very descriptive of what it can feel like when we're immersed in change and not quite sure where we are going next or what comes next after the churning, after the goo. When you're going through change, have you ever had an experience which you would describe as goo? Perhaps different parts of yourself have been called on to reframe and regroup, perhaps over and over, as you wait to see what will emerge. When we're going through change, things can feel messy. I'm sure you've experienced this. Things can feel messy. Things can feel decentered. For some of us, a state of goo may be mostly how we've known life. For others lucky enough to know some stability, we hope any goo we encounter won't be too startling, won't be too messy, or too challenging. Throughout this book, Reverend Herring invites us into what she calls chrysalis space, that space of feeling safe in the goo, to underline the need to practice patience and acceptance as various parts of our caterpillars reframe and regroup through the goo. Patience is critical. A butterfly won't emerge from a chrysalis until it's ready. Open a chrysalis too soon, all you will get is goo, my friends, not a baby butterfly. Has any change you've gone through felt like goo? Has it felt messy? What was the change? Are you still living in the change? The more you can trust the change, the better to remain centered on the outcome. Perhaps a beautiful butterfly will emerge, or a new personal relationship, or a new approach to community or congregational life. Once the goo has percolated long enough, a second helpful metaphor for trusting change, which we read about in this book, advances the metaphor of a threshold. Consider how the image of threshold can expand your experience of change, and perhaps your experience with interim ministry. A threshold is a stoop or a strip of wood, or sometimes some other materials, which we cross over to enter into a new space, such as at a doorway. I think we all know what thresholds are. The modern concept of the word threshold came from medieval practice. When grain was threshed, the parts of the grain were separated from one another, enabling the farmer to collect the nourishing parts and leave the inedible chaff behind. Thus, a threshold represents that place of crossing over from what was to what will be a new state of being by casting off old habits which no longer serve us. A threshold might be seen as a place where defenses come down and doors open to something new, to quote Reverend Herring. The comparison of threshold with a chrysalis, I hope, is apparent. Both represent change and transformation. Both represent a state of being not quite here, not quite there, often described as liminal space, until it's time to emerge into the new, into a new butterfly, a new grain that is edible, a new mode for personal or community life. In some ways, a threshold is simple and quick to negotiate, a single line to cross. But crossing a threshold may involve a long time of discerning. Consider a common image of a threshold, which, granted, we may more likely see in old-timey movies these days. But the threshold of new life partners, crossing a particular line in a doorway after a marriage ceremony or a union ceremony, stepping across a threshold, a single door frame, marking a distinctly new way of life once across that line. That threshold is a single line, but the decision to cross over it may have been a long time in the works. That is, some thresholds may require extended periods of discerning as we gain clarity about what we are leaving and where we're going next. The longer or the more challenging the threshold, the more we call on that human quality of courage to venture into new areas. This type of courage, the courage to cross thresholds, the courage to make change, not big muscle courage like on the battlefield, but internal courage of the soul, will be one of the qualities we explore in our upcoming retreat series called Circles of Trust, which begins on February 4th, 2 Saturdays from now. The sponsoring institution of this program is called the Center for Courage and Renewal. This institution, this center, took the name courage for a reason. It often requires deep personal courage to move toward new habits of compassionate communication and trusting relationships, like we will practice in Circles of Trust. Circles of Trust builds new habits of trusting relationships within our own selves and with others who we share this retreat series with. So I encourage you to look ahead, starting February 4th, Circles of Trust. As we did during my previous sermon on change, let's bring these new ideas about trusting change into some tangible conversation. We have a few extra minutes this morning. We're well on good time this morning. I want to invite you to turn to someone just briefly and express to that person something about change that you've experienced recently. Perhaps you've had an experience of goo. Does this metaphor of goo make sense to you? Tell the other person, when have you been in goo? Or when have you been crossing a threshold? Talk to one another. Find a conversation partner. We'll take about 2 minutes to do this. Let's concretize these metaphors. So turn to one another. When have you been in goo, or when have you crossed a threshold? I'll ring a bell in a minute to make sure that everybody has enough time to talk. Make sure your conversation partner has time to talk. I'll give you 1 more minute.
Well, as I was listening to you, I was thinking about moving into new houses and how, like, when is it over? You know, is it over when I move in? Is it over when I have the furniture on? Is it over when the pictures are on the wall? Or when you move out? Right. When is that transition over?
Okay, finish up your stories of goo and thresholds with one another. I trust these metaphors work. I trust they've conveyed some additional sense of what change is about. As this congregation continues through interim ministry, may we each strive to keep ourselves as centered as possible by trusting changes which we are experiencing. May we all continue to recall the words as well as the song of our opening hymn, "Don't be afraid of some change." May we all have the courage to rejoice and come in to new ways of living and being. May all this be so.